Okay, I'm back again, and this is going to be crazy because this is totally, really unrehearsed. I'm reaching back into the fog of memories long past, and again, completely unprepared. Again, one of the themes is how great the people I've met and, the relation to music and all of that. So here we go. In Lagunitas, yeah, I was noodling on flute up in the redwoods, and a guy heard me, guy named Phil Wood. He played at our favorite band, the Sons of Champlin, and he said, "Man, you got an ear. You want to come over and jam with us?" And I said, because they lived right up the street. This is in Lagunitas. They lived in this famous house called the Argentina House. It had been built by Teddy Roosevelt, not only as a hunting lodge, but a place to stash his mistress from Argentina. And it was owned by Wally Haas, who was a grandson of Levi Strauss. You might have heard of him. You might be wearing some of his jeans. Yeah, it was a legendary place. The Grateful Dead lived there at one time. The Airplane lived there at one time, and the Sons of Champlin, or parts of them, were living there while I was in Lagunitas. And again, this is we're talking way in the country, and the houses are far apart. They're on big lots, yada yada yada. So my response is, "Oh man, I'm not worthy. You guys." And Phil said, "No, no, we're not playing with the Sons, although we will do some of that." But he said, "You got a jazz ear," and I'm trying. He was a trumpet player mostly in the band, and he said, "Yeah, I'm working on keyboard because I want to play standards, jazz standards, and you can just play the melody along with it." So he became my jazz mentor, and I told you about the saxophone lesson with Louis Asen a long time ago, but this predated that, I believe. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. But Phil started teaching me some stuff. He said, "See, that note, that's really an important note. That's the flat five." And me being a drummer is like, the what? The flat what? And so he started telling me, and then one time he said, "Oh man, that tune, that's just the same old boring 3-6-2-5-1." I said, "Wait a minute, Phil, I'm hiring you to give me a lesson in harmony because you know what, you're playing these chords on the piano exactly the way I hear them." And so he says, "Okay." So he comes to the house, again, two houses away, although they're a half a mile apart. And he says, "Okay, here's I want you to learn Stella by Starlight, which has got a whole lot of changes." And he's showing me. He said, "See this first chord. This is how you read these fake charts. It's an E minor 7 flat 5. So you play the E in the bass with this pinky, and you play the melody note with this pinky." This was how he's basically explaining it to me. "And then you find with your right hand, you find the other notes in the chord." And I'm sitting there going, E minor 7 flat 5, and I'm playing that. And I said, "That sounds awful. That can't be right." And eventually, as I gave up on that, and he said, "Well, what's the next chord?" And it's an A dominant. And I went, "Oh, now that E minor 7 flat 5 sounds correct because you got to go to the A dominant," and so on and so forth. So the scales came off my eyes, and I started to see the fake chart of what I had been hearing because I grew up listening to jazz, and when Ben and Ellie and I were wiring all those old amps, and that's all we listened to was jazz, either the KJAZ, the Bay Area Jazz Station, or Charlie Parker. We just heard tons of Charlie Parker, Oliver Nelson, Miles Davis, all of the hip jazz shit. Now remember, this was the early 70s. It was quite a while ago. So Phil, being a typical broke musician, I offered him a job at Mesa Boogie, and he worked there assembling for quite a while. And one time he told me, he said, "Hey, there's this funky derelict marina with this crazy lady that runs it, but she likes jazz. So let's go down there after work. And she's got a piano." So he played piano, I played flute. And the lady liked this old tugboat Annie. She liked what we were playing. And I looked out, and there's a guy sitting on the top of a houseboat. And it looked very much like this. This is the one I bought and lived on for 4 years at this derelict marina. And this guy was sitting up on the roof of the thing in his shorts with a cocktail and listening to us play jazz. And I said, "Man, that's a lifestyle I could relate to." I was between marriages, and I didn't feel like driving all the way back to the Lagunitas place every night after working at Boogie. because it was lonely, and it was, times had moved on. Now I could be happy either there or in the factory, but it was upsetting to keep going back and forth. So I saw that guy and I thought, man, that's what I want. So I went up to Bethel Island. Well, first of all, with Phyllis, I said, hey, Phyllis, can I rent a spot from you? And she said, yeah, sure. There's a waiting list, though. And I said, well, how long is it? And she says, 400 years. And I thought, oh, my God. So we had a couple of boogie parties there because, again, she's just barely making it. And so we had a couple of, like, Halloween parties and Christmas parties there. And we ran up a big tab. And she only served beer and wine. And then one day I said, so Phyllis, let's take a walk down on these docks. What about this boat ride? Oh, that son of a bitch, he hasn't paid me rent. What about this boat? Well, that's Brad. He's paying for one boat. He's got 5 down here. Well, what about these? These are sitting in the mud on the bottom. You can't even see them at high tide. Well, that son of a bitch, he said. And I said, okay, here's my plan, Phyllis. I'm going to move this boat here, move that boat there, move these 2 over here. That clears out this space. And she's like, yeah, no. And Phyllis, I will pay you 1 year rent in advance. And she, you will? Okay, you're in. And I said, well, how much is that? And she said, $1,000. I said, sold. Okay, $1,000. So I go up and I found this houseboat, and it was a real clean boat because it had only been on Lake Shasta, so it hadn't been in salt water. Now, the Petaluma River is historic because it joins the farm country around Petaluma with a paddle wheel steamer, a couple of them. One of them is called the Steamer Gold, and it ran farm produce and eggs and chickens and butter and everything to San Francisco during the 49ers gold rush. It was how the city. So, and this marina, it was owned by the Gilardi family. It was halfway. The river is about 11, 12 miles long from Petaluma to the bay. And Gilardi's is right about in the middle of it. And so she was only allowed 2 liveaboards. And so I won't, this isn't going on too long. At any rate, there was I got moved in. So I found this boat up on the Delta, the Sacramento Delta. And I had it up there for, a couple of months putting around and everything. And I finally brought it down once I got all this straightened out with Phyllis, brought it down. The damn thing nearly sank on the way. And I'm out in the bay and I'm thinking, God, this thing is really getting sluggish. So I got back and opened up the hatch. There's water like almost 3 feet deep back there. And I'm surprised the engine's still running because half of it's underwater. And I go, shit, what happened to the fucking bilge pump? So I'm banging on it, and finally it starts up again and pumps it out. And, well, I made it. But that's part of the history of this boat, is that shit broke all the time. Reminded me of that Bug-Eye Sprite. In fact, here's a story worth recounting. One time I was out on this boat and it dies. And when the engine dies in a boat, you don't just coast to the side of the road. You're floating down the river. And, between the wind and the tidal current, there's no control. So I figured out, okay, the fuel pump gave up. So what can I do? It's got this big galvanized 50-gallon fuel tank back there. So I go back, lift up all the hatches, and pull out the vent tube, which is just a piece of, black rubber hosing. And I get a wine cork, and I start blowing into it using my saxophone, deep, hot. And I keep blowing, and jam the cork in. Now I've got positive pressure in this giant gas tank. Vroom, 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 thing started right up. And I made it all the way back home. Okay, so now we're getting into the musical part because, man, there was the hottest freaking jazz combo that played there. These guys were the devoted. These were the real jazzers. These guys, I'm going to give you some of their names. Terry Henry was the leader of the group. He played piano mostly, but trumpet and bass. Really, he could play anything. Don Weed on alto, Vince Wallace on tenor, Davis Ramey on guitar, Larry Basket on trumpet, who, by the way, did all of the finish trim on the Mesa Boogie offices. any rate, these guys played, quite a bit above my level. And when people have asked me at the racetrack, don't you get scared? And I thought, not nearly as scared as I got trying to sit in with these guys. And at first, they did the usual jazz thing to try to blow me off but the fact that I lived there, see, kind of gave me a bit of an in, and I knew when to lay out. That's very important. Is like they'd play a tune, oh yeah, I can kind of play that tune. Um, and it was pretty funny because one night, I mean, this went on for years. Um, One night, I was finding some pretty good grooves, and Terry, the leader, he's got this little microphone just sitting on the top of this old upright piano, and he's got his ashtray with at least one Pall Mall at a time going on it. Hey man, get up on the mic. Get up on the mic. You sound good, man. And so I'm trying to breathe, and every time I take a breath, man, is this Pall Mall. And finally he says, man, after that, man, you sound good, man. You need to get yourself an amp, man. Get yourself a little Peavey so we can hear you better. You see, these guys had no idea about Mesa Boogie. They had no idea that this funky cat living on this derelict boat in this rundown, fucked up marina was actually an industrial magnate who controlled and invented high gain and all of this death metal and all of this shit. They had no idea. And these guys were so broke. A couple of stories. One, I asked Don, I said, man, Don, you're just killing it, man. How much time do you spend practicing? And he said, all of the time. I never stop. I sleep with my sack strap on, working on my chops, on my embouchure, moving my lower jaw in front of, I mean, it was these guys. Another time the guy said, hey, man, do you have a car? And I said, yeah, well, I need to get some cough syrup. Will your car make it up to town? And I said, well, yeah, come on, I'll give you a ride up there. So I'm waiting in the parking lot. He comes back. Shit, man, they only had 8 bottles of Robitussin. And I thought, oh, man, this is jazz. This is real jazz, all right. And, who came there one night and was just amazing was Chet Baker, of great fame. Unfortunately, poor Chet spent probably more of his life in San Quentin prison than he did playing, but a beautiful cat. And you jazzers, you would know who Chet Baker is. Trumpet, sang, just a brilliant guy, but man, the heroin did him in. But he was so kind, he reminded me of Phil. He made me feel worthwhile, like he was just a beautiful human being. And he ended up hiring Terry Henry to accompany himself, Chet Baker that is, on a trip to Europe. Now, we were talking about how jazz musicians can't make it in the U.S., they can make it in Europe. So he hired Terry, and so they toured Europe until that fateful night in what's the capital of the Netherlands there, where of Holland, where Chet went out the window to his death on the street. I guess he didn't pay the heroin bill or whatever it was. And one night, this was cool too, Frank Gambale. We talked about him last time. What a pal that guy is, and how I got to used to play piano with him when he lived, especially when he lived right up the street in Palm Springs. But years prior to that, when I was living on this wonderful houseboat, and man, that was a lifestyle. Frank came to Boogie, and he was hanging out, and I told him, I said, hey man, tonight's the night where we got this little jazz combo, man. And Frank said, well, I don't have a guitar or anything. I said, well, we got this Schecter Telecaster, and we'll just grab some amp, which happened to be, I think it was a 50 caliber or something like that. So we show up down there, and these guys give me the death look, and it was like, what? And he told me later, he said, look, it's okay when you sit in, but man, don't you go bring in some stranger in some rock and roll with a boogie amp and a Telecaster. No, man, forget about it. And so Frank, being Frank, is so humble. He just sits there for about 3 or 4 tunes doing nothing. And finally, Terry looks over and gives him the nod. And y'all know Frank Gambale. He starts to play, and their jaws just drop to the ground. that was a session that went on practically till dawn, man, because Frank just was just like, oh shit. And then the guy told me the next time I saw him, Terry said, yeah, man, well, remember what I said, don't bring anybody, but that guy, oh shit, can you get him back here, man? That was incredible. So here we go again. This is so much fun, recounting these crazy stories about episodes in my life, the people I met, and how music figures into it all. So that's probably a pretty good place to stop. All right, thanks everybody. If you listened this far, I appreciate it. I'm happy to be back and blowing the reminiscences here. Okay, cheers. See ya.